Chapter 5. Sanctuary. Zethusala's shift companion, Shikanaman 7923, was uncharacteristically late, so the young Jihari scientist let his mind wander freely into the story he liked to tell himself about his own past. Perhaps not surprisingly for a seven-brained arachnid, he had demonstrated superior academic potential from a very young age. Like all Jihari elite, his designated name heavily dictated the expected trajectory of his career. While not quite at the same level as the Zimodian lineage, there was no question that the Zethusala line was certainly very prestigious, with one leaning more towards leadership and military, while the other was strongly encouraged to focus on academia and science. There was plenty of room for overlap, of course, but the name of Zethusala rarely, if ever, achieved the title of general. A further distinction between the two lines could also be made from the fact that scientists were expected to become specialists, whereas it was effectively demanded of generals to become nothing less than brilliant polymaths, well-schooled in every subject imaginable. Notwithstanding the fact that Zethusala was far too obsessive-compulsive to be anything but a specialist, he could not help but find it mildly amusing to think that, had there not already been an incumbent Zimodian, then his anointed name may well have seen him directed down a military path. Just the thought of it was almost enough to make him laugh out loud. But fate, it seemed, had known better. Even so, his decision to choose deep Zircadian history as a primary elective had been a highly controversial choice, which had succeeded in capturing the disapproving attention of his queen. It was perhaps worth noting that deep Zircadian history referred not to the arachnopomorphic interpretation of the Zircadian species, but to that of Zircadia itself. No, deep Zircadian history was a generally frowned-upon course, and only available in the curriculum because it was mandated to be there by the Shimagentia Accords. Anyone who actually elected to take it did so at their own peril, as it typically equated to political, cultural, and social suicide. It was, in fact, one of the only courses ever created where the better your grade, the more damaging it became to your future prospects within the hierarchy of the nest. Naturally enough, Zethusala achieved the highest score ever recorded. However, Zethusala was a seven-brained Jihari, and as such far from a typical student. His future prospects in the sciences, and most especially in the field of technology, not only endured but flourished in spite of his anomalous and increasingly problematic worldview. For a young Zethusala, deep Zircadian history had, metaphorically speaking, opened up his 10th eye. An almost sacred awakening of wonder and horror in equal amounts. That Zircadia had once been home to such a vast array of species and breathtaking variety of life seemed almost inconceivable. His favorites, of course, had been the mammals. That such wondrous creatures could ever have roamed the land went far beyond the scope of even his wildest imaginings. They wore their skeleton on the inside, a fact so mind-numbingly counterintuitive that it could not help but be true. Heavy, water-fat, and soft-limbed creatures swinging their way through the exotic trees of reputedly endless forest ranges. Fantastical beasts covered in thick, downy fur, from the whitest of light to the blackest of night. This was the prehistoric Zircadia of old, and it was a veritable wonderland of riches. That such diversity of life had once inhabited the entire planet, and that it was they, the Zircadian arachnid, who was actually responsible for their annihilation, and then, as a crowning achievement, the complete collapse of the Zircadian ecosystem itself created within him a deep, visceral self-loathing, both for his own life of Jihari privilege and for the ignorant bliss of his entire species as a whole. So deep Zircadian history had undoubtedly played its part in turning Zethusala into a very driven arachnid, but rarely, if ever, a happy or peaceful one. His tortured worldview, and its effect on his character, had largely left him friendless and alone, which in turn only further perpetuated the resentment he felt for his own species. Yet it was undeniable that over the course of the previous year he had developed a uniquely close bond with the good doctor, Zikatika, 3479, and it was he who had suggested clandestinely joining the Rangers as a possible solution to the existential crisis that had inevitably come to confront him. So here he now found himself. Nest Zitalia's very own Arachna non grata, who almost inconceivably was the proud member of an elite group known as the Rangers. No longer was he bound or limited to the goals of his home nest, but instead to that of the far more altruistic agenda of the supernest itself. Yet, in spite of the Rangers' inarguably elevated status, which included the management of Supernest Himenia's sanctuary, never before had any nest donated a seven-brained Zihari to such a selflessly unprofitable service. In fact, it was exceedingly rare for any Shihari at all to ever join the Rangers, as most queens would never dream of allowing such a prized and limited resource to escape the bondage of their own nest. There could be little doubt, then, that he had brought Queen Zitalia great shame and humiliation, and he shuddered to think what she might choose to do to him were she ever able to get her hands on him again. Of course, her attempts to nullify his membership had been unsuccessful, as the majority of queens had been strongly in favor of keeping him exactly where he was. Zitalia may be queen of the largest and most senior nest within the group, but she was still just one queen against many. As for the Rangers, what they lacked in numbers, they more than made up for in their unique status as an authority that lived outside the jurisdiction of any one queen. To say nothing of the fact that they also enjoyed nearly exclusive access to all of the bleeding-edge technologies that the Supernest could collectively muster. In other words, the Rangers were not to be taken lightly or otherwise fucked with. Dr. Shikatika had been right, of course. Zethusela would be about as happy here as it was possible for an arachnid of his particular disposition to be. Ultimately, it still fell well short of the unrealistic dreams of his naive youth, when he thought that somehow he alone would be able to single-handedly change the entire trajectory of the Cicadian species. That, of course, was nothing but a childlike illusion, and his real-world choices were far less heroic. He could die at the hands of his queen, making an honorable but ultimately futile stand against the autocracy, or he could escape her clutches and avoid allowing her to exploit and distort his own genius, while doing the little that he could to try and preserve a planet already at the tail end of decay. In the end, it really hadn't been a difficult decision to make, even if it was still a rather depressingly uninspiring one. The problem was the undeniable value that he could have added to the pursuit and progress of artificial intelligence research presented an irreconcilable ethical dilemma that he had to largely wage within the confines of his own deeply secretive mind. The brutal truth of the matter was that when it came right down to it, he simply didn't believe their species was worthy of a future beyond Zicadia. Not when they had done such a horrifically magnificent job of destroying their own home planet. If their life on Zicadia was to be seen as a test for obtaining their interstellar license, then they had surely failed, and in the most emphatic way possible, by quite literally killing the instructor. It would of course have been pure heresy to have voiced such a view publicly, a complete repudiation of everything it meant to be a loyal and contributing member to the greater collective whole. The nest was everything and everything was the nest. Without it, the individual had no real meaning or purpose, beyond their own petty self-serving wants, needs, and desires. As much as it may have seemed otherwise, this traditional collective idealism was not something that Zethusela had entirely abandoned. He did, in fact, see it as a kind of reconciliation and recompense, that the only way he could possibly serve the nest with honor, while still remaining true to his own deeply held beliefs, was to join the Rangers as a form of principled, self-imposed exile. Zitalia, for all her flaws, just like every other Xylectial queen, ultimately had her eyes set firmly on the stars. Well, good for her, but Zethusela sincerely believed that such singular vision was tantamount to thinking that running away from your problems was the same thing as solving them. The stars alone would never be a solution to the deepest failings of their own species, and in the worst-case scenario, might even make things incomprehensibly worse. No, what they took with them, or more to the point what they were able to leave behind, was what really mattered the most, and Zethusela simply didn't believe that they were yet ready or worthy to take their place as spacefaring spiders of the cosmic web. That some nests had already fled Zicadia, with a very small few even successfully founding homes on other distant worlds, didn't prove anything. All they had actually done was take their disease with them, and in the many millennia to come, would undoubtedly destroy their new habitats, just as surely as they had destroyed the one they had fled from. Or maybe he had simply got it all wrong and was nothing more than a bitter and lonely arachnid who hated his own kind so blindly that he had become the very disease he wanted so badly to cure. Yet regardless of his own very obvious failings, history still told a damning story. Surely then it was only right to want change, so that they might truly heal and evolve into the wise shepherds of the cosmic web he still desperately hoped that the Zircadian species might one day become. So when all was said and done then, maybe his choice to become a ranger was born from little more than an infantile desire to seek redemption on behalf of his entire race. Perhaps he still stubbornly clung to a fragile fragment of hope that in spite of so much evidence to the contrary, the Zircadians were still a species capable of rising above their own nature in order to finally arrive at a place of true greatness. The Shihari scientist, now seeking comfort in the proof of his own brilliance, flicked on a small custom-installed switch, discreetly hidden beneath a false panel on his high-tech armored bodysuit.
Are you there, Zeon?
And exactly where else could I possibly be?
The suit's custom AI replied dryly. Zethusela, now feeling better already, smiled broadly.
It wasn't a real question, as you well know. However, this one most certainly is. Can you get a read on the location of Shikanaman, as he's never been quite this late before?
I can, and he is almost here. At his current relative velocity, I'd say you have about 2 minutes left to wait, assuming you stay put, of course. Oh, and by the way, after some consideration, I've decided it would be very prudent to inform you about an anomaly I have recently detected, which I rather suspect you may find more than just a little bit concerning.
Really? And what might that be?
Someone or something has been searching through our residence at the Grand Palace.
Oh, come now, Zeon. You know as well as I do that the security and surveillance at the palace is virtually impenetrable.
The scientist replied incredulously.
There is no need to state the obvious, Zethusela, which is, of course, precisely why I hesitated to tell you about my findings in the first place. However, the key word here is virtually. I can simply draw no other reasonable conclusion, no matter how improbable it may seem to be.
What exactly do you mean by that?
Zethusela said plaintively, a note of genuine concern now clearly evident in his voice.
I mean, Zethusela, that I was able to confirm that almost every single item that could be moved was moved, before being carefully returned to its original position with an unreasonably high degree of precision, just not quite high enough to escape my detection. The consistent level of deviation simply leaves no reasonable doubt that your residence has been ransacked from one end to the other, in the most thorough and professional fashion possible, and that great care was then taken to put everything back exactly where it had come from. Anyway, I just thought you should know.
Zeon added casually. The Shimatiri drone Zircanaman, also originally from Nest Zitalia, now suddenly came into view, fully suited up and carrying his helmet under one of his forelimbs. Zethusela waved nonchalantly to his shift companion as they both started to head for the sanctuary's main entrance. Zeon's news had left the Shihari scientist feeling badly shaken, and he would have to see what he could do to further tighten up the security at his residence. But the fact that it had been circumvented at all told him Zitalia had not quite finished with him just yet. Zethusela proceeded to discreetly flip the hidden switch back to its original position, before quickly putting his helmet on. A vast array of optical readouts immediately assaulted his visual cortex.
You are very late, Shikanaman.
Zethusela grumbled over the comslink.
I know, and I really am very sorry,
replied the Shimatiri drone apologetically.
I had some technical issues with my suit's helmet, so could not message you directly in order to let you know. But it's all sorted out now, I promise.
Zethusela just grunted back non-committally, and the fully armored rangers, who were now being watched by a small cluster of delinquent spiderlings, made their way through the primary entrance and into the awaiting sanctuary beyond.